Good evening. I'm Steve Weberg. I'm a senior writer and editor in the Public Affairs Department of the Kansas City Public Library. And I'd like to welcome you to what for us is a very special, long-awaited presentation. Almost 13 years ago, back in January of 2008, the library was just ramping up what would become what's now a nationally recognized signature series of evening speaking presentations. We reached out then to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth to partner with the library on a panel discussion on the 40th anniversary of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. The college, if you don't know, is where the Army's top young officers go through graduate school. The alumni have ranged from MacArthur and Eisenhower and Patton to Norman Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell. And the faculty features some of our country's top military historians. It's been a bedrock of our programming ever since that first discussion of Tet. Louis DiMarco was scheduled to give the Command and General Staff College's latest presentation back this March. 8 days, as it turned out, after the pandemic forced the library to close its physical locations, and the same day that Kansas City's first stay-at-home order went into effect. Needless to say, we had to shelve the program. Lou has been patiently standing by since then, and we couldn't be happier that he and the Command and General Staff College are back with us tonight. And I know that many of you who joined us are as well. We'll continue to feature a Command and General Staff College speaker online roughly every other month until hopefully we can gather again in person sometime after the first of the year. Lou DiMarco's with us as a speaker, I think, for the 5th time in the past 6 years. He's part of that impressive lineup of military historians at the college that I was telling you about, where he's taught since 2001. Lou teaches or has taught military history, combined arms tactics, and elective courses on the history of modern urban warfare and modern warfare in the Middle East. He's a West Point graduate. He has 2 master's degrees, including one from the Command and General Staff College, and a doctorate in history from Kansas State. He spent more than 24 years in the Army as an armor officer and retired from active duty as a lieutenant colonel. Tonight, Lou's going to walk us through a surprisingly forgotten World War II battle in the Pacific that, among other things, highlighted the challenges and the horrors of urban warfare. The liberation of the Philippine capital of Manila from the Japanese in 1945 took 29 days, and as Lou will explain, was absolutely devastating in its brutality, in the number of lives lost, in the degree of destruction of a great city. Lou literally has written a book on urban warfare. He authored an Army field manual on urban operations, and he's written 2 books, including Concrete Hell, Modern Urban Warfare from Stalingrad to Iraq. His other book is War Horse, A History of the Military Horse and Rider. So we're in good, knowledgeable hands tonight, as we always are with the Command and General Staff College. Lou, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to be here tonight to share, as was said, a relatively unknown, but one of the most brutal battles that marked the U.S. campaign in the Pacific, and brutal not so much and I'll talk about this, not so much in terms of from the standpoint of U.S. forces, but brutal from the standpoint of the Philippine population. It's the only major urban battle of the Philippine campaign, and it was also the largest urban battle that the U.S. participated in World War II, and set a precedent in terms of considerations and tactical approaches, and also the danger to the civilian population of urban warfare that we still have to pay attention to today. And so now, for the rest of this presentation, I will walk you through kind of a graphic representation of the key characteristics of the battle. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions. So bear with me as I deal with the technology. I've done virtual lectures and classes before, but it seems every organization uses a different mode of meeting up virtually. And so this is my first time full up with Zoom, and so I will try not to touch the wrong button here. So we're going to switch over to my slides. And so I'll walk you through the Battle of Manila, and these are the things I'm going to talk about: the strategic situation in 1945, the campaign leading up to the battle, and then the physical characteristics of the battle, or of the city of Manila, the armies and leaders involved, the plans for the battle, and then step by step, day by day, kind of the process of the battle, and then talk about what are some of the major lessons learned that are relevant to us today.
So go back to Zoom. And go to slides. Slideshow. There
Okay.
you go.
So we'll walk you through here. So these are the things I'm going to be talking about. So to understand the Battle of Manila, you need to place it within the context of the World War II and the Pacific Theater. So 1944 was really the decisive year of the beginning of the American offensive. In June and August, the Central Pacific Theater under Admiral Nimitz begins its campaign in the Marianas and successfully seizes islands Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, and those then become the bases for the subsequent strategic air attack that begins, that the 20th Air Force begins to prosecute with B-29s against Japan. In April and May of 1944, General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command completes operations in New Guinea and is prepared, bypassing major Japanese bases at Rubble and Truk, leaving Japanese garrison in the Southwest isolated, and is prepared for the next phase of the operation, leading to capturing staging bases for the eventual invasion of the main islands of Japan. In August of 1944, there's a meeting to discuss strategy between Admiral Nimitz, the Central Pacific Theater commander, General MacArthur, the Southwest Pacific Theater commander, and President Roosevelt flies to Oahu to meet with his theater commanders to decide on the next step. The Navy's view is that the next step should be the invasion of the island of Formosa, known to many of us as Taiwan, and that seizure of that island should be the main staging base for the invasion of Japan. General MacArthur, his opinion, is opposed to invading Formosa, and he favors a return, in his words, a return to the Philippines. General Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, is concerned that MacArthur's view of invading the Philippines is colored by his unsuccessful defense of the Philippines in 1941-42, and that he is trying to redeem himself for the loss of the Philippines. And he advises General MacArthur to keep his personal views separate from his professional military opinions. But depending on which historians you read and whose accounts you trust the most, MacArthur makes a very eloquent and persuasive case to President Roosevelt that it is the best military decision to invade the Philippines and use that as the launching point for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which will begin that summer with Okinawa, and then proceed in the summer of 45, and then proceed in the fall of 1945 with the invasion of the main islands themselves. Other historians believe that that there was a little bit of arm twisting by MacArthur privately with President Roosevelt, alluding to the 1944 elections, and how bad would it be if President Roosevelt had to run for re-election without redeeming the Philippines prior to that election. And so there is, though, a strong military case, and FDR's ultimate decision was to back MacArthur and authorize the beginning of the return to the Philippines, and that would happen beginning in October 1944, and would be an extensive campaign. So this map shows you the campaign for the Philippines. It's not a single battle. There are multiple battles. Ultimately, beginning in October 1944 with the invasion of the island of Leyte, U.S. operations in the Philippines continue right up until the end of the war in August of 1945. They're characterized by a series of invasions. In October of 1944, the King II invasion of Leyte is the first incursion into the Philippines, and then is followed in February 1945 with the invasion of Samar Island just to the north of Leyte Island. Operation Love 3 begins in December of 1944. You can see the green arrow there points to Mindoro. Mindoro is an island neighboring Luzon Island, and the Mindoro operation is designed to set up a bases on Mindoro that will be the stage for invading Luzon itself. The Luzon operation, and I'll talk about Luzon in more detail in a minute. Luzon's the largest island in the Philippine archipelago, and it's scheduled for January of 1945. And then in February of 45, Palawan Island is invaded, and then ultimately March through July, operations continue in Mindanao. And you can see, as I've noted on the slide here, that Japanese forces on all of these islands, because of the Japanese strategy, which I will talk about in a minute, hold out until the atomic attacks against Japan in August of 1945. And ultimately, it's the surrender of the Japanese emperor that ends hostilities in the Philippine Islands. The Japanese army doesn't surrender in the islands until Japan surrenders. And it's very difficult at the end of the campaign to persuade some of these commanders, Japanese commanders, to surrender. Ultimately, members of the Japanese royal family fly to the Philippines after the war and are taken around to the different defensive positions that the Japanese are still holding and make personal appeals on behalf of the emperor to get the commanders to surrender. Despite that, isolated Japanese units continue to hold out to the Philippines for the literally the next 30 years. And you can, the last known Japanese soldier in the Philippines doesn't surrender until 1974 on the island of Lubang. A Japanese enlisted soldier basically held out there, stealing food and subsisting off of nature in the mountains of that island for almost 30 years. So that's the campaign within which, and the strategic situation within which the Battle of Manila occurs. That campaign, just to give you a kind of context, over 300,000 Japanese are defending the various islands in the Philippines, and the U.S. attacking force consists of a force that is numbers over 500,000 in total, and the casualties virtually, at least statistically, virtually the entire Japanese garrison perishes in the defense of the Philippines. Only 12,000 of the over 300,000 surrender, and U.S. total casualties are about 60,000. The focus of the campaign is the main island, the largest island of the Philippine archipelago, and that's the island of Luzon, also the northernmost island, and it contains the capital city of Manila. And from this map, you can see Luzon's a very unusually shaped island, kind of an L shape, and Manila Bay and the city of Manila are kind of at the junction of the two legs of the L, essentially in the center of the island, although the northern part of the island is much larger than the southern part of the island. The city of Manila itself is roughly 5 miles by 5 miles, or 25 square miles. This is a contemporary 1940 map of the city. It sits at the apex of Manila Bay, and depending on your source, the population, civilian population in 1944, 1945, when the Americans returned, is approximately 700,000 people. But depending on where you draw the boundaries of the city itself, that number can actually go up to slightly over 1 million residents if you expand this city boundary slightly more than I have on this map. So the city itself, this map here, though not quite as accurate as the previous map, gives you an appreciation of how Manila sits relative to the bay and the other terrain in central Luzon. The bay itself is fairly large, a good anchorage. At the mouth of the bay here on the left side of the map, you have the island fortress of Corregidor, which was the last bastion of the American defense in 1942. And north of Corregidor, you have the Bataan Peninsula. This is where the majority of the decisive fighting happened in 1942, and where ultimately the U.S. Army in the Philippines surrendered to the Japanese. And then from Bataan, the infamous Bataan Death March originated as the tens of thousands of U.S. and Filipino prisoners were marched north out of the peninsula, and many of them, thousands of them, died along that march. So you get a better feel from this map how Manila sits at the apex of the bay, and then Laguna Bay, which is a freshwater bay inside or on the island itself, feeds by the Pisag River through the city itself out into Manila Bay, and that'll become relevant as we look closer at the details of the battle. This is a 1940s aerial photo of Manila, and you can see in 1940, Manila is probably the most modern city in Asia, and that's primarily due to the U.S. investment and U.S. interest in the Philippines, which had the Philippines became a U.S. protectorate territory in 1902 after the what the Filipinos call the Philippine-American War. In American military history, it's called the Philippine Insurrection. So from 1902 to 1935, the Philippines, with Manila as the capital, is a U.S. protectorate. In 1935, Manila becomes a Commonwealth of Manila, which gives it, with its own president, and gives it the Commonwealth sovereignty over all domestic affairs, while the U.S. government retains responsibility for defense and for foreign affairs. So it's a pretty modern city. Architecturally, it's a very unusual city in Asia. A lot of Spanish influence, 300 years or so of Spanish dominance in the Philippines, and then 40 years of U.S. influence, and then, of course, traditional Asian influence, not just indigenous to the Philippines, but a large Chinese influence, as there is a large Chinese expatriate population in the Philippines that had been there for generations. One of one of the unique characteristics of the city, and this is an early 1800s picture, but I use it because it illustrates clearly the Mandora Fortress, which is a Spanish fort built in the 1500s, ultimately becomes central to downtown Manila. And it is a typical European star-based fortress with 40-foot thick walls, and was the center of Spanish governance in the Philippines, and then becomes the city of Manila. Basically grows up around this fortress. The original fortress walls and defenses are still there, and you can see them in this 1940s picture. That is the way the fort looked at the time of the battle, or before the battle occurred. The participants in the battle are the U.S. Army and obviously the Japanese Army. The U.S. Army primary organization is the 6th U.S. Army, which is responsible for recapturing the entire island of Luzon. The particular task to go to capture Manila is tasked to the 14th Corps, a subordinate command of 6th Army, and then the 14th Corps for the operation basically has control of 3 U.S. divisions: the 37th Infantry Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 11th Airborne Division. On the Japanese side, the defense of the entire Philippine island group is the responsibility of the 14th Army Group. In southern Luzon, the Shimbo Group has command responsibility, and in Manila itself, the Manila Naval Defense Force, numbering 16,000, mostly sailors, but about 4,000 of that number are Japanese Army. They are in particular responsible for the defense and operations in Manila. The 3 U.S. divisions in total have about 35,000 combat troops, and the Japanese at about 16,000. So you have a ratio of about 2 attackers for every 1 defender. The key commanders on the U.S. side: General Kugler is the 6th U.S. Army commander. And of course, I don't list him here. And probably when I put this slide together, the reason I didn't list him here was because kind of so ubiquitous and obvious to the operation. The senior U.S. commander is actually General MacArthur, the Southwest Pacific Theater commander. And then under him, General Kugler commands the 6th U.S. Army. In the Philippines, there's actually 2 U.S. armies operating, the 6th U.S. Army and the 8th U.S. Army. About 2/3 of the entire U.S. Army in the Pacific is committed to this campaign. Like I said, about over 500,000 troops. The 14th, and General Kugler, this is kind of his last hurrah. He retires about a year after the war ends, and this is his last combat operation of the war, commanding the forces on Luzon. His subordinate commander is Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold. He commands the 14th Corps, and the two of the 3 divisions, and the 2 most important divisions in this battle, the 37th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Begeitler, and then the 1st Cavalry Division, commanded by Major General Mudge. Those 2 divisions are unique. Each of them are unique in the theater. The 37th Division is an Ohio National Guard. Their nickname is the Buckeyes. Big surprise. And General Begeitler is a National Guard officer. In World War II, in total, the U.S. fields almost 90 divisions. Many of them are National Guard divisions that are activated for the war. But out of that large number of divisions, only 2 of the original National Guard officers actually remain in command to take the divisions into combat. And General Begeitler is one of them. He is a career Ohio National Guardsman. In civilian life, he's an engineer and businessman in Ohio. starts the war as a colonel in the 37th Infantry Division, and then by the time it is committed to combat, he's the division commander. In contrast, the 1st Cavalry Division is one of the purest regular Army divisions of World War II. And what I mean by that is, unlike most Army divisions, which are formed in 1940 or later with draftees, the 1st Cavalry Division was a horse cavalry division that was organized after World War I. And so when World War II started, it was completely manned by regular Army cavalrymen on horses. It was originally, so it was ready for combat when the war started, one of the few divisions that was combat ready. And therefore, after Pearl Harbor, it was quickly rushed to the Pacific Theater. The anticipation was it would go to Australia and link up with horses in Australia, and then become a horse cavalry division once it got into the Pacific. So they brought their saddles and all of their horse equipment with them, but no horses. They figured they would get the horses in Australia. Turns out they never got on a horse again. The horse equipment was all left in Australia, and still today in Australia, in antique stores, you can find U.S. Army horse equipment left there by the 1st Cavalry Division. But as a regular Army division, it was considered by MacArthur to be one of his elite divisions in the theater, and often kept in reserve and employed when MacArthur thought that he needed to add extra combat power to create success or to speed up the pace of operations. And that's exactly how they come to be committed in the battle for the Philippines, or for the city of Manila. On the Japanese side, the 2 key commanders are Lieutenant General Yamashita, who is overall in command of Japanese forces in the Philippines, and is personally in command of the Japanese forces on Luzon, and has his headquarters initially in Manila, but then makes a decision to move his headquarters into northern Luzon. When he moves his headquarters, he leaves in Manila Japanese Navy Rear Admiral Awabuchi. And Awabuchi commands the Manila Naval Defense Force, that 16,000-man force tasked to remain behind in Manila. Awabuchi is an interesting Japanese officer in that his last combat experience, he's never commanded on ground forces before, and his last combat experience was in the Guadalcanal campaign, where he commanded a Japanese battleship that was sunk by the U.S. Navy. And so historians believe, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, that he comes into this battle with a big chip on his shoulder to regain his honor, which he perceives he lost when his ship was sunk back in 1942. So the plans. The U.S. plan is fairly sophisticated and solid plan by modern standards. It's a kind of plan that we would use today to capture a city. The U.S. is going to use 3 divisions, the 37th Infantry and the 1st Cav coming from the northern part of the island, and then the 11th Airborne Division, which lands by sea in southern Luzon, is going to come from the southern part of the island. And basically the plan is the 37th Division will approach directly into the city from the north. The 1st Cavalry Division will approach the western or the eastern suburbs from the north, and then capture key objectives on the outskirts of the city, and then slide around the city and surround the city, linking up on the southern part of the city with the 11th Airborne Division. The key objectives assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division are the water supply of the city, which comes from a reservoir north of the city, the electric power stations that provide electrical power to the city, and also the Allies know that several thousand prisoners of the Japanese, Allied prisoners or prisoners of war, and internees. Internees are civilians mostly American, who were caught in the Philippines by the beginning of the war. And although they're not treated as prisoners of war, they are in a detention camp in Manila, and the conditions there are terrible, and many of them are dying. And so those are the special objectives assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division. The Japanese plan, and I stress the word plan, is that the Manila Naval Defense Force will destroy all of the key military facilities, the docks primarily, and the bridges over the Pasag River, and then evacuate the city, and then join the main Japanese forces in the mountains and jungles to the east of the city to defend and delay against the Americans. General Yamashita's overall strategy for not just Manila, but the defense of the Philippines was, he knew he couldn't win, but his strategy was to tie down as many American forces as long as he could to allow the Japanese military to prepare the home islands, build defenses in the home islands for the eventual defeat of the anticipated American invasion of the home islands. And so Yamashita's plan is not to win this battle. Yamashita's plan is to delay and distract and destroy as many American forces as he can, buying time for the defense of Japan. And so in Manila itself, in accordance with that strategy, the Japanese Defense Force there is supposed to evacuate the city after they have destroyed everything in the city that is militarily valuable. So how does the battle go? MacArthur, as the overall commander, had spent in his 30 plus years of military service at this point, or actually 40 plus years of military service at this point, had spent almost half of his service in the Philippines. This returning to the Philippines is his 5th time that his military career he's been at the island. He started out as a lieutenant of engineers after he graduated from West Point in 1903 in the Philippines. After World War I, he returned as the military commander, as a 1-star general and the military commander of Manila itself. Later, as a 3-star general, he returns again as the overall commander of U.S. forces in the Philippines from 1924 or 26 to 1928. And then after he finishes his stint as the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, he's hired by the Philippine government to come back to the Philippines as a private U.S. citizen working for the Philippine government, and is given the title of Marshal of the Philippine Islands to rebuild or to build a Philippine military in anticipation of full independence in 1946. And so those 4 times he's already served there, and in most of those assignments he lived in Manila. And so returning to the Philippines for his 5th time, he has as a priority not only to recapture the islands, but in particular to liberate the Philippine, or the capital city, Manila, where he had lived from 1932 until 1941 when the Japanese invaded. So he had lived there for 9 years in a penthouse apartment in the Manila Hotel. And when he had to leave, his departure was so abrupt, he left literally all of his personal belongings there, including the MacArthur family china, which had a U.S. value of over $30,000, and his personal library, which contained over 10,000 books. All of that was left, and Mrs. MacArthur was allowed to bring with her when she left literally just 2 suitcases of personal belongings. And so this is coming home for MacArthur. The liberation of the city is personal, and he takes a personal interest in not only that the city is liberated, but exactly how it is liberated, to the point of as the four-star general in charge, monitoring and advising how the 1st Cavalry Division will organize and conduct operations to hit its key objectives. In particular, he's interested in that internment camp where the American civilian population are being kept at St. Marcos University in downtown, Santo Thomas University in downtown Manila. There's about 3,700 civilians in that camp. They're dying at a rate of 7 a day from mostly malnutrition and diseases associated with that. And many of them are personal friends of or acquaintances of General MacArthur. And so he makes it a top priority for the American Army, and in particular the 1st Cavalry Division, to liberate that camp and rescue those civilians. So this shows you in detail how the initial operations in the battle for the city go. U.S. forces in the form of 1st Cavalry Division arrive in the city after fighting their way down from Luzon, from the central plains of Luzon. The 1st Cavalry Division, with MacArthur's urging, moves 100 miles in 5 days. And on the 3rd of February, the first elements of the division reach the outskirts of the city. The 37th Infantry Division, which is really the main effort and has responsibility for the downtown part of the city, they arrive on the 5th of February, so a couple of days behind the 1st Cavalry Division. They have a much more difficult approach, a lot more bridges. If I had showed you a larger map, you'd see there's a lot of rivers, canals that intersect the route that the 37th Division was following. The Japanese blow all of those bridges, and so that slows that division down, and they get there a couple of days later. And they have a different mission than the cavalry. The cavalry has the mission of going to pinpoint targets. The water filters system, the dams for the reservoir, who they fear the Japanese will blow, depriving the city of its water supply, and the prison camp, and the electric power generating system, which is hydroelectric powered by the water also from the dams of the reservoir. And so the cavalry are focused on those objectives, where the infantry on the east side of the city, correction, the west side of the city, the left as you look at the map, they are responsible for recapturing essentially downtown Manila. And this first phase of the campaign outlined in that blue box, the first week of February goes relatively smoothly as the prison is liberated on the 5th of February. By the 5th of February, the 37th Division has pulled up alongside the 1st Cavalry Division. And by the 8th of February, all of northern, or most of northern Virginia, or northern Manila, there are still some pockets of Japanese holding out. But north of the Pasag River, most of that part of the city is secure relatively quickly. And so this first part of the operation goes pretty well. Likewise, coming up from the south, the bottom of this map, the 11th Airborne Division has been moving 40 miles along the southern coast of Manila Bay to attack the city from the south. And their advance also goes relatively smoothly, and they reach the outskirts of the city in the south around the 12th of February. Meanwhile, while the 37th Division is securing the northern part of the river, the cavalry does not stop. As you can see with the sweeping blue arrows, the cavalry proceeds to swing around the city and link up on the southern part of the city with the 11th Airborne Division, and proceeds all the way to the bay itself. That effectively surrounds the Japanese defense force in the southern part of the city, isolated in this fortress in the southern part of the city. And here is where the Japanese deviate from the plan. Rear Admiral Awabuchi who was supposed to evacuate the city and join the Japanese army in southern Luzon and hold out as a delaying force in the mountains and jungles, decides he is going to defend the city to the death. Most historians believe, well, it's recorded that this is in direct violation of his orders, and the intent of the Japanese army commanders. And most historians believe this is an attempt by him to regain his honor, which he felt he lost when his battleship was sunk in the naval battles off Guadalcanal earlier in the war. And so he orders his 16,000 man force, rather than leaving the city, after they destroy the docks, sink the ships that are in the harbor, the Japanese ships that are in the harbor, and blow up all the bridges, they then begin to dig in for a deliberate defense of this part of the city shown in this picture here. They build machine gun positions and anti-tank positions into all of the buildings. They dig tunnels and trenches to connect the buildings so they can move from one building to another without exposing themselves. They put in minefields, they put in barbed wire, they dig anti-tank ditches to stop American tanks. They crater the roads. Unlike most Asian cities of this time period, Manila, because of its American influence, there's a lot of cars, private-owned cars. They take these cars and they build them into roadblocks on all of the major roads into this southern part of the city. And so he prepares the Manila Defense Force for a last-ditch final stand in the southern part of the city. The unit that's tasked with reducing this pocket is primarily the 37th Division. The problem that the 37th Division has is that all of the bridges across the Pasag River have been blown up. So they're going to have to stage an amphibious operation to move across the river before they can, and secure a foothold on the other side before they can attack the Japanese main defensive positions. And so on the 7th of December or February, the 37th Division, north of the El Mindoro fortress complex, and west of it, east of it to the right, conduct an amphibious crossing of the Pasag River. Once they get their forces across the river, they decide to take about a week to clear the area that is to the east of the fortress and prepare and cross over armor and logistics. They've got to build bridges and use rafts to bring armor and artillery and logistic support across the river. And it takes them about to the 12th or so of February to clear the area to the east of the El Mindoro fortress. Then they are ready to attack into the heart of the Japanese defenses. And you can see in these small pictures around this map that by this time in the battle now, about a week into it, the Japanese defenses have caused the Americans to start using a lot of artillery to reduce these Japanese strong points. And you can see the buildings that the Japanese choose to defend are primarily the modern concrete and reinforced steel construction government buildings. These buildings are turned into fortresses, and the Japanese literally have to be blown out of those buildings. And in the process, essentially the buildings are destroyed, and any civilians who are caught anywhere in the area of the buildings or in the buildings themselves are become what euphemistically are called collateral damage, not intentionally targeted by the Americans, but in the process of digging out these determined Japanese fighters, a lot of munitions are expended, significant damage is done to the buildings, and lots of civilians are killed. And that's just to set up the main attack into downtown or into the heart of the southern part of Manila. That main attack begins on the 27th of February, primarily again conducted by the 37th Infantry Division, with supporting attacks coming from the south by the 1st Cavalry Division. The 11th Airborne Division at this point in the battle has moved off into southern Luzon to do other operations. And so there are two divisions attacking, the 37th from the north across the river, and the 37th directly from the east into the main heart of the Japanese defenses, and then the 1st Cavalry Division attacking now from the south into the southern part of the Mindoro area, and what is also called the Manila South Dock area. And these attacks are incredibly difficult to prosecute. The Mindoro fortress itself, although it was built in the 1500s, the walls of that fortress are 40-foot thick. And in order to penetrate them, the Americans actually used tactics similar to what early modern armies of the 18th century would use to attack this kind of fortress. Instead of using artillery in its traditional role, where it fires from behind the lines over the head of troops, they bring the artillery up to the front lines and fire it directly into the 40-foot walls in order to knock down the walls, so that the infantry, to create basically a breach of rubble that the infantry then can climb in order to get on top of the Japanese defenses and into the fortress itself. In the fortress itself, once you're in there, then it's again similar to the fighting that had happened outside the fortress. Building by building, the Americans have to go in and dig the Japanese out. They use flamethrowers, they use grenades. The preferred method is to try to get to the Japanese without physically going into the room with them. And so if they can get to the top roofs of the buildings, the American troops get on the roofs of the buildings, blow holes in the roofs, enter the buildings from the top down, armed with grenades and flamethrowers, and then clear the rooms one at a time, throwing grenades into the rooms and then using flamethrowers on the rooms. And remember, these buildings are concrete and steel construction, so you can use these type of systems inside these very well constructed buildings without endangering yourself. And then methodically, and then eventually going into the rooms, hopefully when the defenders have been incapacitated or killed by the flamethrowers or the grenades. In some cases where the Japanese are in basements and they won't come out and they can't get in there with flamethrowers or grenades, they pour gasoline into the basements of these buildings and light it. And of course, sad to say that the Americans are assuming that there are no civilians in these buildings, but oftentimes the civilian population is trapped in the same buildings that the Japanese are defended. Sometimes the Japanese bring the civilians in there and use them as human shields. And so in the process of this house-to-house, street-to-street fighting, there are many civilians that are being killed. And again, I'll talk in more detail about that. It's a brutal fight. The Americans are conscious that if you fight this fight fairly, gun to gun with the Japanese, the Americans are going to lose a lot of guys. So they prefer to use their artillery, and they prefer to use these more distant effective weapons like bazookas, like grenades, like flamethrowers, so they don't have to go into the rooms and fight the Japanese hand to hand. A week of intensive fighting is necessary before the Japanese garrison is essentially wiped out. The Japanese admiral commanding commits suicide in his bunker. Any Japanese soldiers that are isolated in this area, I should say naval personnel, sailors, they commit suicide rather than surrender, or they hold out until the Americans figure out a way to eliminate them. But by the time we get to the 3rd of March, southern Manila is secure, and the Americans are able to declare the city itself secure. But it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory, because when you look at the lessons, the results, U.S. casualties for a battle this size are relatively light. And that's because of the tactics that I discussed earlier. 1,000 KIA, that's a not insignificant number of casualties, but compare that and 16, roughly 16 or 6,500 overall U.S. casualties. That's relatively light, given that there are 33,000 U.S. troops. So that's about 1/6 or 1/5 of the force becomes a casualty, which by modern standards is high, but by the standards of the Pacific War is relatively low. This is February of 1945. At the same time this battle is going on, the Battle of Iwo Jima is going on. In comparison, 16,000 Japanese troops defending here attacked by 33,000 Americans. On Iwo Jima, it's 25,000 Japanese attacked by 75,000 U.S. Marines. In this battle, the U.S. Force, which is smaller than the Iwo Jima force, suffers 6,000 casualties. On Iwo Jima, the Marines suffered 25,000 casualties. So the ratio here in the Battle of Manila, the U.S. Army suffers 1 casualty for every 6 soldiers committed to the battle, roughly speaking, 1 to 6 or 1 to 5. On Iwo Jima, the Marines suffer 1 casualty for every 3 Marines. So the casualties on Iwo Jima are much higher than in the Battle of Manila, although the defending forces on the Japanese forces are equally ferocious. The Iwo Jima 25,000 man garrison essentially is completely wiped out and dies to a man. There are POWs, but not a significant amount. And likewise in Manila, the Japanese died to a man. So from kind of a purely military point of view, the Manila operation is very successful. The casualties are low. The Japanese garrison is wiped out. But that third statistic there is the one that makes the Battle of Manila different than any other battle in World War II that the American ground forces, Marines or Army, participated in. And that is the 100 to 200,000 civilians who are killed in this battle. So on both sides, if you add all the numbers up, you have about 17,000 military casualties. Conservative estimates of civilians killed are in the 100,000 range. Those same conservative historians will admit that it could be as high as 200,000. Some historians think the number is more like 500,000. Okay, and that's at the extreme wide high edge. But remember, the population of this city is only about at the most about 1 million people in rough numbers. And so if you have 200,000 civilians killed, you lost 1/5 of the population, and that's killed. That's not civilians who are wounded. And using military numbers as a guide, you can figure there are at least twice as many wounded as there are killed in any military conflict. And so if you figure 200,000 civilians were killed, you're talking about 600,000 civilian casualties, or almost roughly 2/3 of the population becomes a casualty in this urban fight. And if you use the $500,000 killed number, you're talking about everybody in almost the entire population of Manila is either killed or wounded. And this is kind of the legacy. And you've got to remember that although the Americans, had to, prioritize defeating the Japanese over protecting civilian lives, the Philippines at this point is a part of the United States. It's a commonwealth that has that is under the authority of the United States. The American Army and Americans have been living, the American Army has been stationed in the Philippines for 40 years, and the commander, MacArthur, and literally every one of the commanders I showed you, except the National Guard, had been stationed in the Philippines for extensive periods of time prior to the war. The American Army has a very close personal relationship. MacArthur himself, The president of the Philippines is the godfather of MacArthur's son. MacArthur, at various times in his career as a bachelor living in the Philippines, had Filipino girlfriends and mistresses, even when he was married, and had a very personal, relationship across the spectrum of his life, personal and professional relationship with the Philippine people. And so these are our allies. So there's no doubt that the American Army did what it could to prevent civilian casualties, but you still have these astronomical numbers. Part of the reason for these numbers is the brutality of the Japanese Army in the defense. The Japanese naval commander in Manila, once he made a decision to stay, told his forces that they were to consider all civilians to be guerrillas, and that if they encountered them in the open, they were to be immediately executed. And he specifically ordered that women and children be considered combatants, as well as the male population. And so any Filipino civilian that was caught outside of their house by the Japanese Army was often summarily executed. Casualties, direct casualties due to Japanese executions or murders, atrocities, minimum numbers that could be verified after the war or after the battle by investigators are somewhere in the minimum numbers in the 50,000s. And these were the verified, definitely based on forensics and examination of the bodies by medical personnel, civilians that were deliberately killed by the Japanese Army. Buildings housing school children, hospitals were deliberately set on fire by the Japanese military, and also resulted in a lot of these casualties. And so the lesson learned of this campaign, which we study in the U.S. Army today, precisely because of the impact on the civilian population, is that how difficult it is to conduct urban operations against a determined enemy in the face of a present civilian population without large numbers of civilian casualties. And the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, and now the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, has told the Army, the U.S. Army, that his vision of war in the future, in the 21st century, is centered around large-scale combat operations similar to World War II, with the addendum that, unlike in the Cold War, in the future, the U.S. Army anticipates these operations will be conducted in large, heavily and densely populated urban areas. And so this battle contains numerous lessons and cautions about the lethality of urban combat. Doesn't provide a lot of answers, but it definitely illustrates the challenges of urban combat in the future, which is why at the U.S. Army General Staff College and other places in the U.S. military, it gets a lot of study. And so with that, let me switch back to the camera, if I can, and entertain any questions that you might have.
Lou, we've had one come in from the audience. Understanding the situation with the American and other detainees, was it truly a sound military decision to carry out this invasion? And how much did MacArthur's personal considerations play into it? Would it have been undertaken without that? And
that is that's the $64,000 question, because you have to get into the mind of MacArthur. On the one hand, MacArthur is the most decorated officer, actually soldier in the U.S. Army prior to World War II. And he was first in his class at West Point, youngest general officer in World War I and youngest chief of staff ever in the history of the Army. So his military credentials are, without challenge. On the other hand, he has this huge, strong personal relationship to the Philippines. And the alternative was to invade the island of Formosa, which would not have been an easy task either. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese on Formosa, but it was only one island. The Philippines consists of 7,000 individual islands. Kind of on the maps, you see the major islands, but literally 7,000 small islands, and the majority of them are inhabited. And so the military tactical problem of attacking the Philippines in some ways is much more complex than it would have been going to Formosa. And so I think historically it's impossible to say definitively that MacArthur was not biased, but I think it is possible to say that just understanding human nature, the fact that his only setback in his entire 50 or 40 plus year career to this point is the defeat in 1942, and then his close relationship and the whole "I shall return" drama influenced his decision. I think that my opinion is that is without a doubt. And then people will tell you that the number one, MacArthur had a number of personal characteristics which everybody agreed on. One was that he was brilliant, and the other was that he was eccentric, and then the third is that he had probably the largest ego in the U.S. military, and was unwilling to listen to differing opinions. His staff was there to facilitate executing MacArthur's plans, not to help him develop those plans. So he was a one-man show. And so given his relationship with the Philippines and his history and his personality, I would have to, in my opinion, come down on the side of that he was going to the Philippines, and the only person who could have stopped him was the president. And he manages to convince the president. One of the quotes I've seen, I haven't personally verified this, was that in a private conversation with Roosevelt, he alluded to the 1944 elections and the impact that would have if Roosevelt opposed MacArthur in the strategic decision to go to the Philippines. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it does sound like something that MacArthur would do in a private conversation, because he was very politically astute. And one of his ambitions after the war didn't come to fruition, but there was a lot of talk in 1948 of him running for president. So he was definitely a politically aware general.
You mentioned the Japanese atrocities. Were any officers, I realize nobody came out of there, but were any officers, commanders held to account for those in war crimes trials?
Yes, a very good question, because it's very controversial. The fact that they were held accountable. General Yamashita, after the war, he survives the war. His army remains, much depleted but intact in northern Luzon, and only surrenders after the Japanese nation surrenders. He's immediately taken prisoner by the U.S. MacArthur is personally invested in holding somebody accountable for the reasons I've talked about, for the civilian casualties in Manila. The Japanese admiral who is directly responsible and gave the orders to do that, to kill civilians and to fight to the death, he kills himself, so he's not around. Literally everybody who is of any rank in the battle on the Japanese side dies in the battle. Yamashita, though, survives. And so they try him in a war crimes trial in 1946. And he is found guilty for not controlling his subordinates who committed the atrocities. So he was able to prove at trial that he actually gave orders to not kill civilians and to evacuate the city. And he made a fairly convincing case that all of this happened without his knowledge or approval, and he was found guilty anyway. And kind of specifically, what they found was that he should have had control and he should have had knowledge, and therefore he was guilty of not effectively commanding those troops who committed the murders, and he was hung in 1946. American civilian lawyers examining that, there's a large school of thought that was his conviction, and the death penalty and execution was a miscarriage of justice. That he, was in no way responsible in giving the battlefield conditions and also the state of mind of his subordinate commander, who was hell bent on achieving glory in the battle, and wreaking as much havoc in the city that he physically, had he even known, would not have been able to prevent it. And so a lot of people believe Yamashita was a scapegoat for Filipino and American vengeance for what the Japanese military did. But yes, so he was held accountable.
One final question. There's always so much interest in the Japanese soldiers who held out. Can you talk a little bit more about the one soldier who held out in the Philippines? What were the circumstances of him emerging, and do you know what became of him afterwards?
Not him specifically, because I can't say that I specifically investigated his story, other than to note that because this happened on many of the islands, I should say, not all of them. Some of the more isolated islands like Iwo Jima, which is relatively small. The garrison, they either got captured or they became POWs. And although there were holdouts on Iwo Jima for months after the battle, and even after the war ended, but nothing like the length of time that this particular individual. And I think on Guam, there was also a group of individuals that held out that I'm a little bit more familiar with. These guys start out as a group of guys, like a squad. They're hiding out from the Americans. After the war, the Americans knew on all of these islands, so the Philippines as well, the Americans knew there were these guys out there. And so on the Philippines, as I said, for the big holdout positions, they brought in the Japanese members of the royal family to talk to them and tell them, yes, in fact, the emperor says surrender. But for these small diehards, finding them and communicating with them was almost impossible. They exist essentially as bandits. So one of the ways they tried to communicate with them, because they don't have radios, is they would take psyops organizations, vehicles with loudspeakers, and drive down roads where they suspected they were nearby, broadcasting the war is over, come out and surrender. Of course, the Japanese holdouts don't believe that. They think that we're lying to them. And they essentially become bandits. They sneak into Philippine or native villages, rob grocery stores, hold people up on the roads. Mostly they avoid contact. They become expert hunters. And these squads that start out, in 1945 as 10 or 15 guys, over the next 30 years, they die off. And so you get down to the last guy, and his last partner has passed away, natural causes or malnutrition or disease, because now if the guy is 25 or 30 years old in 1945, he's in his 60s. So natural causes that, normally attrit people, exacerbated by the conditions that they're living on. And typically with these guys, they get down to one guy and he's just lonely. And that ultimately is the reason that they finally come out and surrender. And then what happens is the Japanese, because this happens all through the 1950s and 1960s, and it's not till the early 70s that the last ones come in. the Japanese government has a system in place by 1974 for repatriating these guys. So the Japanese government comes in, they take these guys back to Japan. They have medical people, they have psychologists, and they have their family. Now, in many cases, their immediate family, wives and parents are long gone. So it's grandchildren and cousins and second cousins that they link them up with. And the Japanese have, in dozens of cases that happened over this period, had a very effective system of integrating these guys successfully back into civilian society. So in most cases, I think in all cases where these guys ultimately surrender, the stories have a happy ending, or as happy as it can be, given that in many times their parents and their wives, friends and family, immediate close friends and family, have passed away since the last time they were in Japan.
Well, Lou, thank you so much. This is what a great pickup from where we left off back in March. So glad that we're, back together, and looking forward to now continuing, extending our long and fruitful series with the Command and General Staff College. Look forward to having you back as well. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you out there who've joined us tonight.